That's what Satan knows. If he can one time prove God lied, one time he can go before God and say, you lied, your word's not true, then God is obligated, I don't know how he would do it, to annihilate his entire temple in heaven. Satan wants to catch God in a lie, and he says, if I can, watch this, stop Israel, never let Jerusalem be the capital, and kill all the Jews, God will be a liar. So that's who he targeted from the beginning, was the seed of Abraham. Is everybody still with me? Come on. Let's consider this. Israel was overrun by the Roman 10th Legion between April and September of 70 AD, 1,940 years ago. When this happened in 70 AD, the Romans struck a coin, and on this coin it says these words, Judea Capta. This is an actual picture of the coin. Judea Capta means Judea has been conquered. Before 135 AD, listen carefully, the Romans before 135 AD called the land Judea and Galilee. They would not call it Israel because the Jews were not living in it. So it was Judea and Galilee. There was a revolt in 135 AD, and there was a man by the name of Bar Kokhba that led a revolt. And after the revolt, Hadrian got so mad that he changed the name from Judea and Galilee to the name Palestine. Palestine is not the actual name of the land. Palestine is the name that was given to it by Israel's enemies. The Roman Empire gave it that name. All maps in the Arab world, any map that you ever find of Israel, is not Israel. It will never say Israel. It will always say Palestine. And it will always have on those maps the West Bank. I'll always put the West Bank under the control of Jordan and not Israel. In other words, they use the old before 1948 maps. Even in Muslim airports, when you have a map of the Middle East, always Palestine. There is not a map in the Arab world made by Arabs, unless it's an Arab Christian who could get himself in trouble, that says Israel. They will all say the name Palestine. Now here's what happened. From that moment on in the 2nd and 3rd century, the Christian church taught God was finished with Israel. God is somehow finished with the Jews. And that, what we call replacement theology, became prominent after this destruction. April through September of 70 AD is when not only did Israel experience this terrible incident, or Judea, but Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus and the 10th Legion. Jerusalem was completely annihilated. After the Jewish revolt of 135 AD, the entire area of Israel became known as, actually the area of Jerusalem, became known as Alia Capitolina. The Romans built a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount where the ruins of the Jewish temple used to be. No Jew or Christian was permitted to enter the city. It was punishable by death. The Arabs started calling, now listen, let's go back. The Arabs started calling Israel Palestine, but they started calling Jerusalem Aliyah, and they called it that name for centuries. Now don't miss the point of what I want to tell you. The adversary thought that they could destroy Israel by changing its biblical name. They then thought they could destroy Jerusalem by changing its biblical name. The prophecies for the end times speak of Israel. It does not speak of Palestine. The prophecies of the end times speak of Jerusalem, not Alia Capitolina. So the enemy uses these nations to try to change the name of Israel and the name of the city, thinking that if the name remains that way, then prophecy will not be fulfilled. Now Jesus had already said that Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Let me give you a list of nations since 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, that have actually ruled that part of the world. And these are nations that have influenced what they call Palestine and Jerusalem. Number one were the Romans. 70 AD, they were headquartered out of Rome, Italy. Following them was what we call the eastern branch of Christianity, the Byzantines, or the Byzantine Empire, headquartered in Constantinople, Turkey. Following them, they were overthrown by the Muslims who took the city in the 7th century, and built the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, two Islamic sites on the Temple Mount. In fact, there's evidence that the Byzantines actually built the 8-sided octagon dome, but it was made into a mosque, and the Muslims took it from that point. Boy, I don't have time to get into that. That's very controversial. The Muslims were headquartered in Iraq, Syria, and Mecca in Arabia. Then in 1099, the Crusaders came. They were from Spain and France and from the West, and they liberated Palestine, and they liberated what would be called Jerusalem from the hands of the Muslims, and they conducted 10 major crusades against the Muslims, back and forth for several hundred years. The Mamelukes then controlled Palestine and Jerusalem for 260 years. They were headquartered out of northern Africa, and they were an Islamic group as well. Following them in 1517, the Turks, they were headquartered in Constantinople, which later became Istanbul, Turkey. Same city, different name. They took it for 400 years. Then the British in 1917, that's the last one on the list. They were headquartered, of course, out of London, England, of the British Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire till 1947-48. Well, that's a story and a half I don't have time to get into. And so this is the order of the empires. Now, can I tell you what do they all have in common? Can anybody look at that list and tell me what they all have in common based on Bible prophecy? There is no wrong answer here. You know, y'all just scared to death. You know, you act like you're in a class and there's a professor up here and he's going to point you out and tell you that that was right or wrong. Here's what they have in common. Ready? None of those are Jewish. Every one of those are Gentile. And Jerusalem would be what? Trodden down of the Gentiles. Woo! Is anybody listening? Until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So, they took Israel, changed it to Palestine. They took Jerusalem and changed it to Aelia Capitolina. Now they're going to have to deal with the Jews. So in 70 AD, once again, when the temple was destroyed, the Jewish people were taken as slaves by the Romans. Others fled for their life. And after David and Solomon had that, let me say David didn't live that long, but after the Jews, beginning at King David through Solomon, had been in the land except for the Babylonian captivity for 1,000 years, only 70 years were they out of their land in that 1,000 years, all of a sudden the Jews become dispersed. The first dispersion of Jews was 722 years before the birth of Christ, when the Assyrians came and took 10 of the Jewish tribes into captivity, and they were scattered. That's called the Lost 10 Tribes. Heard that talked about. Then in 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came, and the Jews were taken captive again. But in 600 BC, there were Jews living in Egypt, Babylon, and Asia. But after the captivity of Babylon, most of the Jews went to one area, the tribe of Judah, around Jerusalem. The tribe of Judah is actually right up on the Mount of Olives. It borders the Temple Mount, okay, even to this day. So, the Jews that return live in Judea, and that's why you read about this king in the time of Jesus was king of Judea, because that's where all the Jews live. All right, now, having said that, stay with me. In 70 AD, the Jews became the wandering Jews. And Jews were literally living all over Europe, all over the world. They were living in the United States, and they had no homeland. Palestine was controlled by the country of Jordan and by the Arab people. Jerusalem, again, had changed hands all these times. How is God going to fulfill prophecy? Well, let me tell you how God does things sometimes. Ready? Are you listening? Sometimes the only way God can get attention of a person is to let something bad happen. Then when something bad happens, what do people do? They learn to pray. They turn to God. One of the worst tragedies that ever happened in the history of the world was something called the Holocaust. The word Holocaust, you may not know this, means a sacrifice by fire. The reason the Jewish time of the time of the Nazis and Hitler was called the Holocaust by the Jews is because Hitler's Nazis put them in trains, took them to camps, and burnt them in ovens. And there were thousands and hundreds of thousands, in fact 6 million Jews that died during the Holocaust by not all of them were burnt, some were put in gas. This is so cruel. When I go to Israel, sometimes I'll go to the Holocaust Museum. It now takes you 4 hours to go through it if you take your time. It's massive. And they show models of these ovens. They show models of a gas chamber. Now I want you to imagine